The Churchville Schoolhouse opens the door to the best education in history. Visitors to the Churchville Schoolhouse take a step back in time to watch history unfold in a restored National Register of Historic Places property that dates to the Civil War era. Students of today walk in the footsteps of local farm children from the early days of DuPage County for an authentic living history experience led by a schoolmarm of the early 1900s. A visit to the Churchville Schoolhouse is hands-on, educational, and fun. Participants use slate chalkboards and McGuffey readers for the day's lessons. And children will be asked to follow proper classroom etiquette. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are practiced, and students test their skills during an old-fashioned spelling bee. And of course, no school day is complete without recess featuring games of the early 1900s. The schoolhouse is a popular place for scouts and day camps too. Group visits can also be arranged for service clubs, tour groups, and other adult organizations. The Churchville Schoolhouse Living History program is operated by the Elmhurst Historical Museum. Call the museum today to book a field trip or find out more information. Call 630-833-1457 or visit our website at churchvilleschoolhouse.org. The Churchville Schoolhouse is waiting to open the doors for your school or community group. Plan a memorable learning experience today for the best education in history.
Have you heard of the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation? Its purpose is to provide support through advocacy, education, and fundraising for the Elmhurst History Museum, our local Elmhurst history, and the Churchville one-room schoolhouse. Established in 2007 as a nonprofit organization, we initiated an endowment fund and raised funds to complete the renovation of the historic Churchville Schoolhouse. We conducted a capital campaign to develop the new exhibit, by all accounts, the story of Elmhurst, at the History Museum, and we continue to provide financial support to enhance exhibits, programs, and events at the museum. Yes, we feel strongly about our mission and encourage you to become a member or donor of the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation. Please call or go to our website for more information to learn about the benefits of becoming a member or donor by investing in our town, our history, our heritage.
Welcome to Elmhurst Time Travelers. I'm Ken Bartels, your host. We're here at the Churchville Schoolhouse. Brian Bergheger has been the director of the Elmhurst History Museum since 1988. During that time, he's taken the museum from a small, local, regional, almost exclusively Elmhurst museum and turned it into a regional wonder. He's had some help, but he's been the driver. We're delighted to spend some time with him today as he is about to retire. Far too early in my opinion, but that's up to him, of course. But we're welcoming Brian to the Churchville Schoolhouse, one of the places that he helped to create and helped to acquire during his time as director. He also was instrumental in creating this Elmhurst Time Travelers program. This is number 32 in the Travelers series. So Brian, welcome.
Well, thanks, and thanks for those kind words. I appreciate that, and I would not believe that we're up into the 30s already on the Time Traveler program.
Happy early, almost sort of retirement. It's October, as the audience knows, and so you've sort of headed out of town, so to speak. But I want to go back to the beginning. I want to go back to, when did Brian Bergheger know that history was going to be his profession?
You know, I don't think there was any one specific moment when the light went on. But I do give my parents a lot of credit. They took my brothers and myself on many vacations to explore other places, and we always went to museums, and particularly places like Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian museums. They also spent time talking about historic issues, and at the time I didn't realize they were so historic, but it was dinner table talk about race relations in the mid-60s and escalation of the Vietnam War and other issues that were important to them, and I realized that those were issues that had a basis in the past.
And so where did you grow up? Where were these conversations taking place?
I grew up in a wonderful small town of about 5,000 people called Mascoutah, Illinois. It's east of St. Louis, about 25 miles. And it was a very special place. It was a wonderful place to grow up. The community was a combination of kids like myself, whose parents worked in town, owned businesses. My dad was an accountant. So the car dealers, the drugstore, the dentist, and so on and so forth. There's also Air Force Base nearby, Scott Air Force Base, which was at that time and still remains a major installation. And all of the Air Force kids attended Mascoutah schools. So that was an addition that I think a lot of school kids in other communities couldn't enjoy. And we also had farm kids that were part of that pie of, or mix of kids. And Mascoutah was, as I said, a great place to grow up, and I still have family there.
Well, a town of 5,000, obviously you know a lot of people, but the mix that you just described of Air Force personnel, children, and farm and urban, that would have provided a rich environment for a school that probably wasn't all that big.
Absolutely, and it was a school system that was larger than would normally be in a community of 5,000 people because kids were bused from the Air Force Base. And it was a historic time, actually, as well. I didn't realize it until I got older that a lot of the kids whose, at that time, it was primarily their mothers were with them. Their fathers were serving at other locations in the United States or overseas at that time. My father grew up in that community, and as you mentioned, I knew a lot of people. It was a great place in hindsight because a lot of people knew me and my brothers, and it was a good way to keep an eye on all of us, I think.
Well, it takes a village. Okay, so you go off to college where and studied what?
Well, at 18, I took off to college in St. Paul, Minnesota, McAllister College. And I think I chose that place because, one, it was away from home. I wanted to get away from the town I grew up in. Didn't value it so much at that time. But it also had a relatively liberal reputation. McAllister was a school of about 2,000 people, and it was committed at that time and remains committed to matters of internationalism, social justice, and public service and so forth. And I went there being a history major, thinking that maybe I would teach history. I knew that there were history teachers. I had some teachers in high school who were wonderful and pointed me in that direction. While I was there, I had the great opportunity to meet some professors and take some classes from these individuals who kicked us out of the classrooms, really into the neighborhoods and into museums and into, for lack of a better description, into the community. And we did community studies, community histories, and it was a great way to experience history outside of textbooks and outside of a classroom. And I think maybe I caught the bug at that point and realized that people actually work in museums and there's an opportunity for careers. And so I graduated from McAllister, and at that time I had a plan. Believe it or not, I had a plan. My plan was to work a couple years in museum setting, and then go to grad school in museum studies. And there are such things as museum studies programs at the graduate level. So I was fortunate to be hired by the Minnesota Historical Society, and I started down that road at that point.
So wife Carol comes along when in this story?
Well, my wife doesn't come along until much later.
Okay.
After I
well,
arrived
insert
here.
her wherever it is that it makes sense as we go along here. So you're working in Minnesota. For how long? How long were you engaged in Minnesota? Because I know at some point in time you move on to a place called Montana.
Yes, the road took me to a number of different locations. And I think that's something that I really enjoyed and I treasure in my memories. But I worked a couple years for Minnesota Historical Society. Okay. Initially, I was hired as an interpreter at the state capitol. I think that was probably almost the lowest job on the totem pole at Minnesota Historical Society at that time. We gave tours to tourists, to school groups. If you ever visit the state capitol in Minnesota, be sure to ask your interpreter, your guide, to go up to the gold lions, because the gold lions are up around the dome on the outside of the building. And as interpreters, we hated to go up there. And we'd always find some excuse not to do that. Nonetheless.
Yeah, they're closed today.
I was soon hired in the Division of Archives and Manuscripts. And there I was assigned the job, with several others, of processing records of the Great Northern and Northern Pacific Railroads. And I tell you, that was a magnificent job. It was somewhat daunting because there were pallet after pallet of boxes of records from these railroads, which were some of the first transcontinental railroads in the United States, going across North Dakota through Montana, Idaho, and out to the Pacific Ocean in Seattle and Portland. But there were also early national companies in the United States. And it was a matter of going out to the storage area, getting one cardboard box, processing that, and adding to a written finding aid, and then getting another box.
Getting another box, right?
It was slow, but it really gave me an appreciation for historic records, because I was reading and analyzing records that went back to the 1870s. And the railroads were magnificent companies when you think about it, because they not only were laying track and creating engineering records in order to lay track, but they were also land companies. They had land companies. They were selling land, trying to populate the region so that people would start farming and use the railroad and generate income for the railroad. They also had mineral rights throughout Montana and Idaho and Washington, so they were selling those off. They were also into marketing and promotion, particularly later after the turn of the century, when they were really the first promoters of Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park. So there were all sorts of records that I was able to handle, which was very cool for a historian, and then analyze and put into an order that would be useful for researchers. And I was glad to see many years later that the project was actually completed. So
Sure.
I was at Minnesota Historical Society for quite a while, for 2 years, and then went off to Cleveland. This is before Montana. Went to grad school, Case Western Reserve University, in a museum studies program. And it was a program that was designed for small museums. My experience at MHS, Minnesota Historical Society, really led me to feel that I'd be more rewarded personally, I think, and professionally in a small museum setting. And so I spent 2 years in Cleveland, another great place, at Case Western Reserve University, and was inspired by the people that I met there working in museums and in this graduate program.
And then it was off to the Western Heritage Center in Billings, Montana. Was that the next stop?
Almost.
Almost.
Almost, right. The road took another turn before I ended up in Montana.
You can get to Billings from Cleveland, I know that. But
yes.
apparently not this time.
Right. I actually went back to Minnesota Historical Society, was rehired while I was looking for a full-time museum director position. And at MHS, I wasn't working on railroad records anymore. I was working on the Hubert Humphrey papers, which again is a spectacular collection. Humphrey was a product of either North Dakota or South Dakota, but then served as a senator for Minnesota, was a mayor of Minneapolis. One of those odd things, I learned he was a professor and instructor at McAllister College back in the late 40s or early 50s as well. So I was processing his public appearance files and learning about life in Minnesota for a politician, and I appreciated the opportunity to really learn about an individual like Humphrey back in the 50s, handling his original legal pad speeches that he scribbled notes on and so forth, and seeing how he went from town to town campaigning. He helped create the Democrat Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, the DFL, and it was a spectacular opportunity, again, to immerse myself, I think, in historic records. So from there, though, I took off to Kansas, to Garden City, Kansas. It's in the southwest part of the state. And I was the director, hired there as the director of the Finney County Historical Society. It was an institution that was privately owned. It was a private nonprofit, even though it had a county as part of its name. And it was a small institution located in Finney Park in Garden City. And Garden City, believe it or not, had, and I believe it still does, have a zoo. So there was a zoo next door to the History Museum, and also the largest concrete swimming pool in the United States, at least at that time in the very early 80s. And Garden City was a fascinating place. Again, it gave me an opportunity to really look at how communities are built. And that was part of the study that I did at Case Western, is community studies. You know, what are the ingredients in any community? And you look at the people, of course, but why do people move here? Why do they end up in southwest Kansas, of all places? How do they make a living? How do they create institutions like government and churches and schools and so forth? And I was at Finney County for about 3 years, I believe, and then had the opportunity to go to Montana. And that's an interesting story as well, because after I had graduated from college, from McAllister, I had actually applied for a job at the Western Heritage Center in Billings, Montana. I thought that would be a cool place to work. And I wasn't hired initially after graduating from college, but a few years later I was hired as the director of the museum. And so I made my way up through Kansas and Nebraska and Wyoming into Montana, into Billings. And the Western Heritage Center, another fabulous museum. Actually, it interprets the Yellowstone River Valley. The Yellowstone River flows north out of Yellowstone National Park, and then it turns east and flows through Montana and meets the Missouri River in eastern Montana. At that time, and I believe it still is, the longest undammed major river in the United States. And we had a larger staff, could do a lot of really fun things for that region. We were a regional institution. And we told the stories of cattlemen, of farmers, the Native American populations, both the Sioux and the Crow reservations weren't too far away. And the natural setting was also a big part of the interpretation that we did. So we did traditional exhibits. We also did, for several years, a folklife festival that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we had one of the early Marlboro men who ended up being not only an English professor at a junior college in eastern Montana near his cattle ranch, but he was also a cowboy poet. Wally McRae was his name, and he was a big part of our fest and had native dancers and other types of music and crafts and folk traditions from that region. So I had a great time there, and I think after a while I did miss being near a larger metropolitan area.
So at some point in time, at that point in time, you hear about the Elmhurst History Museum, which of course wasn't its name then, but we'll keep it that way for now. Elmhurst History Museum. And so you find your way here, you sit down for an interview with probably was it Tom Borchert who interviewed you, or do you interview with someone else?
No, it was Tom Borchard,
Okay,
city
Tom Borchard.
manager at that time.
City
and
manager, 40 years in city service. So you're sitting with Tom. So why Elmhurst? Why did you make that decision?
Well, that's a good question, and it was a fortuitous decision, as you probably know. As I said, I wanted to get closer to a metropolitan area, and this museum had an opening. I was actually offered a job at another museum as well at that point. I was faced with making a decision, and Elmhurst really, I think, was just so much more attractive because of the quality of the museum and also the individuals who were associated with the museum. I think for anyone coming into that type of situation like myself, you try to judge the level of commitment of
Sure.
the governance structure and of the community. And at that time, I know Tom convinced me that he and the city of Elmhurst were committed to the museum and the mission of the museum. And at that time, there was also a citizens appointed body called the Elmhurst Historical Commission, made up of a dozen or so individuals who were an advisory body and advised quite a bit on governance. And the interview process brought me face to face with all of those individuals as well. People like Dick Weber, who still lives here in Elmhurst, and an individual named, other individuals who will remain unnamed. And
Yeah.
they really had a strong commitment not only to the museum, but to other aspects of community life in Elmhurst. And then I think the museum itself was a quality operation.
So it's 1988, you come to Elmhurst. Naturally, your game plan is you're going to work here for 30 years and retire. I mean, that would be completely natural at that point. But what was your game plan when you arrived? You were impressed with what was there, but as a new director, where did you want to go? At that moment in time, where did you want to go?
Well, I think like anyone coming into that position, you initially want to just step back and learn about the place that you've landed. Learn about the place and the people and what's important to them. And we did that. We actually went back and did some strategic planning at that point. And I met with the previous director, Virginia Stewart, who was of great assistance to me at that time because of her experience and her knowledge. And at that point, as a vision became clearer in my mind, I felt we had the opportunity to generate greater private support in the long term for the historical museum, which it was called at that point,
right.
And also to broaden the community services that we were able to offer. The museum was a wonderful gem, and we had a lot of individuals who were very committed to it. But I felt we really needed to broaden its scope and broaden that audience in order to make it grow. Fascinating thing about the museum at that point was that it had started in the 1950s. As you know, it opened in 1957. So the museum had a long history at the time that I showed up and sat down at a desk. And I came to appreciate the history of the museum because given that it had started in the 50s, it had a strong artifact collection, a strong collection of objects that people had given the museum. And I realized that even more as I got into the position and talked to people and learned about the collection, because a lot of those things that were given to the museum in the late 50s or early 60s probably would have gone into private hands, or maybe would have been sold by the 80s or the 1990s.
No place else for them to go.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, individuals pass, or they're deceased, family pass along their materials and so forth. So when you think about it, the 1950s was not that far removed from the Civil War. People living in Elmhurst would have had great-grandparents who lived through the Civil War.
Sure.
And the late 1880s. So that was fascinating about the museum as well, and I think was something that drew me to the collection and you know, generated a greater interest in sharing that aspect of the museum.
What was the first exhibit? We're going to go to break after this question. Okay. What was your first exhibit that you were associated with at the Elmhurst Historical Museum?
You know, I honestly don't remember.
But you're a historian.
But, yes, I'm a historian. Our exhibits at that time were very Elmhurst-centric, very Elmhurst-driven, which is not a bad thing. No. We tried to draw on the collection. We were trying to expand our audience here in Elmhurst, and you know, certainly the individuals who were involved in the museum at that point had very strong family connections to Elmhurst, and there were some of those stories that needed to be told. They were important to, you know, to the individuals who were associated with the museum at that point, and we generated some of those. Some of those drew on the collection, things like costumes and toys. Others were a little broader, you know, looking at the cemeteries in Elmhurst and telling some of the stories associated with cemeteries. Okay,
we're going to go to break, and when we come back, we're going to fast forward quite quickly, actually, and start talking about the current day, because as you leave the scene as director, you're leaving a strong legacy for your successor. I'm curious about what you see into the future as well. This is Elmhurst Time Travelers. I'm Ken Bartels, and we're talking to Brian Bergheger on the occasion of his retirement as the director of the Elmhurst History Museum. We'll be right back.
The Churchville Schoolhouse opens the door to the best education in history. Visitors to the Churchville Schoolhouse take a step back in time to watch history unfold in a restored National Register of Historic Places property that dates to the Civil War era. Students of today walk in the footsteps of local farm children from the early days of DuPage County for an authentic living history experience led by a schoolmarm of the early 1900s. A visit to the Churchville Schoolhouse is hands-on, educational, and fun. Participants use slate chalkboards and McGuffey readers for the day's lessons. And children will be asked to follow proper classroom etiquette. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are practiced, and students test their skills during an old-fashioned spelling bee. And of course, no school day is complete without recess featuring games of the early 1900s. The schoolhouse is a popular place for scouts and day camps too. Group visits can also be arranged for service clubs, tour groups, and other adult organizations. The Churchville Schoolhouse Living History program is operated by the Elmhurst Historical Museum. Call the museum today to book a field trip or find out more information. Call 630-833-1457 or visit our website at churchvilleschoolhouse.org. The Churchville Schoolhouse is waiting to open the doors for your school or community group. Plan a memorable learning experience today for the best education in history.
Welcome back to Elmhurst Time Travelers. We're talking with Brian Bergheger, the director of the Elmhurst History Museum, about to retire. And Brian, we've talked quite a bit about your background. We finally got you to Elmhurst after a travel itinerary across the country. I wonder if you can share with me what you believe to be the 2 or 3 most significant items in your tenure as director. I know 2 or 3 things that I would pick, but it's your decisions that matter at the moment. So 2 or 3 things that stand out, that when you have an opportunity to talk to your successor, you're going to say, well, you know, we did this and we did that and we did this, and it was pretty important at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a number of really great things, I think, that deserve to be talked about with the successor. And I think we're in one of those things that I'm very pleased about, the Churchville one-room schoolhouse. As you know, it dates back to about 1850 and has gone through a number of different hands over its life after closing as a school in 1930. And it was in 2001 that the city acquired the schoolhouse and assigned its operation to the History Museum. And that was a wonderful achievement for the city, and I give a great deal of credit to Mayor Marcucci at that time. Mayor Marcucci got behind that idea and the project and really drove it to the point where a decision was made with the school district, District 205, which operated it at the time. A decision was made for the property to be transferred to the city, and then to go through a restoration and a preservation project, an extensive project that would provide the facility as a place that public programming and school services could take place.
I don't think I've ever asked you this, but what do you think would have happened to the Churchville Schoolhouse if the city of Elmhurst hadn't acquired it in 2001?
Well, you know, I would not be surprised if it would no longer be here. Had District 205 decided to vacate the premises, the schoolhouse would have gone back to the Fisher family, the heirs who originally donated the school. And I know the Fisher family and graduates of the school in the 80s and 90s even, they were living, they were very committed to the schoolhouse. But individuals age and sure, things become more difficult and your interests go in different directions. And so I would not have been surprised if it had been torn down. And today it's on the National Register, you know, somewhat protected from demolition. And I think someone coming into the museum director position has the opportunity to continue to grow the school programming and the public programming here, not only for Elmhurst, but for the entire area. I know we've attempted to expand the school programming here outside of Elmhurst and Bensonville, and we have some other schools from communities in the area and from Chicago itself that come out regularly for school programs. But there's a great potential here.
So, a couple more highlights. Significant things.
You know, in 2006 and 2007, we went through a big change at the museum. It was a change in governing structure, more or less. And a new organization was created, as you know, the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation. It was a combination of two citizens groups who were committed to helping the museum along back in the 90s and the early 2000s. And through a process at that point, the Elmhurst Historical Commission and the Farmer Foundation agreed to more or less merge and make a single organization that was going to be stronger than either of those two individual organizations could ever be, I think. And so those two organizations came together, a new set of bylaws was written, and the organization worked with the museum and the city. It all seems so long ago and seems somewhat pedantic or boring, but I think it was a lot of work that was done by a number of members of those two organizations who wanted to see this happen and committed a lot of energy and time to making this new organization become something that the two farmer organizations, as I said, would never really be.
Well, and the Heritage Foundation celebrating its 10th anniversary as during the year that we're speaking in. Okay, there's two. I asked for three, so you've got to come up with another one.
You know, the other one would probably be the By All Accounts exhibit that opened at the museum in February of about 2015 now. It's been up for quite a while. And that exhibit is what we call our core exhibit. It's a long-term exhibit, draws on the museum collection, and tells the stories of Elmhurst. And going into that exhibit, we had a strong staff. Our project director on the exhibit was Lance Tauser, our curator of exhibits at that time. And we wanted to make that exhibit something special. We wanted to really share a lot of the collection that we have. And I guess that goes back to something that drew me to Elmhurst in the first place, was sharing museum collections with people. And so we wanted to incorporate a lot of photographs that were in the museum collection. We also wanted to include a lot of those special artifacts, and then also include a lot of media in it. So we identified a number of individuals to do oral history interviews with. That material's included in the exhibit. The Heritage Foundation committed to raising funds, as you know, for that exhibit, conducted a $300,000 capital campaign. And that resulted in a special element that we call the tabletop exhibit as part of the By All Accounts exhibit, where people can travel in space and time throughout Elmhurst to see what Elmhurst looked like in the past. And we also included an 8-minute documentary about the Elmhurst community that was narrated by Bob Surratt. And that draws on a lot of photographs and tells stories in a different way than the tabletop, in a different way than the oral histories, and in a different way than the narrative that you get reading the labels that are in the exhibit.
One of the things, at least, let's say in the last 10 years or so, that the Elmhurst History Museum has literally become known for are the rather unique exhibits, always with some kind of a hook to Elmhurst, but at the same time, standalone exhibits, some of which have gone on to other museums and other locations after they've been in the Elmhurst History Museum. But the series of exhibits that has been so well received. The Cubs and White Sox comes to mind, the Magic exhibit, the beer exhibit, the toy exhibit. Do you have some personal favorites in that litany as well?
Well, you know, those are all really favorites. They were great exhibits, and you know, a lot of credit goes to Lance Tauser, as
Certainly.
I mentioned. He was
Absolutely.
our curator of exhibits at that point, and the entire staff at the museum, because our collections staff, Nancy Wilson at that time, who retired last summer,
Right.
was intimately involved with those exhibits as well. But I think going back, I'd go back even farther, and now that you mention it, it was Lance's first exhibit at the museum when he was hired. We hired Lance because coming off our strategic planning back in 2006, 2007, we really wanted to devote more resources to our exhibits programs. And so hired Lance to come in, and we already had an exhibit on the calendar that had not been fully developed. It was at a stage of development, but that was called Jazz in Elmhurst. And
Certainly.
If you recall, that was the first exhibit that we identified as something that could be Elmhurst-based, yet have a broader appeal in the Chicago area. And so we worked with Doug Beach at Elmhurst College, director of the jazz program there, which was celebrating, I believe it's 40 or 45th anniversary at the time of the Jazz Fest, the Elmhurst College Jazz Fest. And also we worked with Downbeat magazine, which was celebrating an anniversary at that time. And Downbeat, the preeminent jazz publication, not only in the nation but internationally, has been housed here and produced out of Elmhurst for many years, since the 70s.
Yeah, almost right across the railroad tracks from the museum.
Exactly. So I happen to know Frank Alkire, who was an editor at Downbeat at that time, and approached Frank about getting involved with us. And we put together this concept, this idea of doing an exhibit about jazz to tell some stories about Elmhurst that people in Elmhurst, as well as other communities, I think had no idea existed. And we also had the rich collections of the Elmhurst College jazz program and Downbeat magazine to draw on for that exhibit. And I remember Lance coming in and kind of wondering, what have I gotten myself into here? But it was really a fun exhibit, and we got to showcase some great things. And the exhibit came together really well. And I think Doug and Frank were both really pleased by the outcome. Yeah. And that set the
Louis Armstrong's
the map.
trumpet in the Elmhurst History Museum.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly, at the museum.
This is a little bit of a, not a little bit, this is a philosophical question, but on the eve of a retirement, you know, there needs to be one or two of those. How has, in your opinion, how has the museum changed Elmhurst, and how has Elmhurst changed the museum over your 30-year, almost 30-year tenure?
Well, you know, I think Elmhurst has changed the museum through something like the Heritage Foundation and its board of directors, the people who have become involved. Like all organizations or institutions, you have a lifespan and a life cycle. And one of the hardest things for any organization or institution is to generate continued interest and enthusiasm for an organization. Reinvent itself, exactly. You have new people. You want to share the institutional history with these new folks who need to become involved. Otherwise, the organization or institution dies. But that institutional history isn't their history. So you need to get people involved and to the point where they're building their own history related to that organization or institution. And I think that's been something that we've been able to do in Elmhurst, through the museum, through the board of the Heritage Foundation.
There's just a higher level of interaction, I think, between the community and the museum and the players on both sides of that equation, whether they be leadership, aldermanic, mayoral, museum, or volunteer, Heritage Foundation, other people important to the museum's operations.
You're absolutely correct. And looking back, I see that the museum's group of stakeholders has really expanded outward over time. Yeah. And that's grown to include both the Elmhurst Art Museum, the Lozadro Museum, Elmhurst College, Public Library, Park District, the City Center organization, and the main business district. It's been a wonderful place to work where I think we've contributed to the impact that they all have in serving as attractions to Elmhurst and serving as parts of the community that make it a better place.
I hadn't forgotten about your wife, Carol, and I know she comes around in the early 90s, which is a while ago, but not that long ago. Raised your family in Elmhurst, so retirement, what are you going to do, Brian? What's retirement going to look like for you?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. It's like that move to Garden City, Kansas, or to Billings, Montana. I don't have a grand plan. I think some people go into it having a 10-page outline put together for what they're going to do. That's not my case. I think for me, it gives me an opportunity to, in effect, travel down some streets I haven't traveled before. And I look forward to doing some volunteer things, looking forward to learning some things that I haven't had a chance to learn about in the past. Certainly I look forward to travel. And I think a year from now, I may have some other things to tell you about that retirement, but that's more or less it. We'll see what's down the street.
So when, in a few weeks or a few months, whenever it is, when you sit down with the person who is hired to succeed you, him or her, what are you going to say?
Well, the first thing is to chill out and learn some things about Elmhurst, and to trust some people, learn who you can trust and count on. There are all sorts of great stakeholders that we talked about here in Elmhurst, and begin to reestablish those relationships with people in Elmhurst. I think also to encourage whoever that might be to take advantage of the opportunities in the position as museum director to find some personal and professional rewards in the job. I know that is often, I think, lost in the day-to-day of trying to get things done and move along. But there are those great opportunities to find some personal and professional rewards and kind of enjoy it as well. And I guess also to organize a block party and take a bike ride on the Greenway Trail and things like that. Yeah.
Well, Brian, have a wonderful retirement. I know you're not leaving the community, and that's to the community's benefit, but your legacy at the Elmhurst History Museum is going to go some distance down the road, and I think the community very definitely joins with me in thanking you for your service. So happy retirement.
Well, thank you, Ken. Thank you for the kind words, and we appreciate all you've done for the museum over many years here. And I know the new person will look forward to your support as well.
Well, I'll look forward to them. I've enjoyed our relationship. We've been talking to Brian Bergheger, the director of the Elmhurst History Museum, who's about to retire after nearly 30 years of service. And we thank him for that service, and we thank him for Elmhurst Time Travelers. And for Ken Bartels, we'll see you again.
Have you heard of the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation? Its purpose is to provide support through advocacy, education, and fundraising for the Elmhurst History Museum, our local Elmhurst history, and the Churchville one-room schoolhouse. Established in 2007 as a nonprofit organization, we initiated an endowment fund and raised funds to complete the renovation of the historic Churchville schoolhouse. We conducted a capital campaign to develop the new exhibit, by all accounts, the story of Elmhurst, at the History Museum, and we continue to provide financial support to enhance exhibits, programs, and events at the museum. Yes, we feel strongly about our mission and encourage you to become a member or donor of the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation. Please call or go to our website for more information to learn about the benefits of becoming a member or donor by investing in our town, our history, our heritage.
The Churchville Schoolhouse opens the door to the best education in history. Visitors to the Churchville Schoolhouse take a step back in time to watch history unfold in a restored National Register of Historic Places property that dates to the Civil War era. Students of today walk in the footsteps of local farm children from the early days of DuPage County for an authentic living history experience led by a schoolmarm of the early 1900s. A visit to the Churchville Schoolhouse is hands-on, educational, and fun. Participants use slate chalkboards and McGuffey readers for the day's lessons. And children will be asked to follow proper classroom etiquette. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are practiced, and students test their skills during an old-fashioned spelling bee. And of course, no school day is complete without recess featuring games of the early 1900s. The schoolhouse is a popular place for scouts and day camps too. Group visits can also be arranged for service clubs, tour groups, and other adult organizations. The Churchville Schoolhouse Living History program is operated by the Elmhurst Historical Museum. Call the museum today to book a field trip or find out more information. Call 630-833-1457 or visit our website at churchvilleschoolhouse.org. The Churchville Schoolhouse is waiting to open the doors for your school or community group. Plan a memorable learning experience today for the best education in history.